All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Commonwealth Institute's In Conversation series. And tonight, we are so delighted to have Secretary Madeleine Albright back to the Commonwealth Institute for the 7th time for her 7th book. So we are just so pleased. My name is Elizabeth Tyler, the Executive Director of the Commonwealth Institute, and I will be your host this evening. But the hard work is going to be done by Pam Reeve, our chair, asking the secretary all the questions. But on behalf of the TCI community, a warm welcome to the secretary and all of you that are here tonight. We have roughly 500 of you registered for this evening, so hang on to your hat. I'm sure it's going to be a great conversation. Very quickly, and most importantly, a big shout out to our sponsors that you see on our screen. Our presenting sponsors, American Tower and Loch Lord, and of course our event sponsors, the Brown Brothers Harriman, the Center for Women and Wealth, Houseworks, Hub International, and RSM. Before we get started, a couple of quick housekeeping details. We will be taking questions from the audience, and on the bottom bar, on the bottom bar, I've been practicing this. Next to the chat, there's a button labeled Q&A. You should click that. And be sure to have the Q&A dialog box open, as you can interact in two ways. You can submit your question, or you can upvote other questions that are being posted. Lizzie Dunkley and Liz Pacelli will be monitoring the questions, and the most upvoted questions will be passed on to Pam towards the end of the program. Don't forget to use the chat function during the session to connect with your fellow audience members. So at this time, I'd like to introduce to all of you, many of you know who I'm going to introduce, Pam Reeve, our chair of the board at the Commonwealth Institute. And at this point, I'd like to pass it off to Pam to take it away with Secretary Albright.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome home, Secretary Albright. So great to have you with us again. Every time you write a book, I think she's told us all of her stories, and there's not much else to tell, and she comes up with yet another book with even more stories. And now I've given up. I know there are even more stories that we'll probably hear sometime soon. This book is titled Hell and Other Destinations. And in order for us to have balance in the conversation tonight, Madeleine, we're going to start with other destinations and do hell in the middle. So we'll start with a subject of transitions. You start the book out in 2001, you've just left government, and you're going through a transition that many people go through at times in their lives when they leave a business, start a business, children leave the home, whatever, and their identity is going through a change. And then later in the book, you talk about entering a phase in your life where you're also going through some transitions, fighting the demon age and all of that. So I wondered if you would talk a bit about that first transition, what the main challenges were for you, and whether there was any person or thing that really helped you in dealing with those challenges.
Right. Well, let me begin by saying how grateful I am to have been invited again. This is a great group, and it's very nice to see old friends. And Pam, thank you very much for doing this, and Elizabeth, and really terrific. So let me, I have had kind of a mantra that I've always wanted to do. The next thing that I did needed to be more interesting than what I'd done before. Not easy if you've been Secretary of State. And so trying to figure out what I would do was something that I actually didn't think about very much. I just knew that I wanted to do interesting things. And what happened was that somebody suggested that I go back to teaching. And somebody else suggested that I start a business. And somebody else said, well, you should be on boards. And somebody else said, well, what about speeches? And I said, fine, I'll do them all. So that, because I couldn't choose. And so I did, in fact, decide to do them all. And it works and worked because my major talent in life is dot connection. And I'm able to take something that I've learned in one area and then make it work for me and be germane in something else that I do. So some of it is pure rationalization, but the bottom line is I think I have put together an interesting combination of things that I have wanted to do. One of my major passions throughout my whole life has been democracy and how to help others have democracy. So one of the other things that I was delighted to accept was to be chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute. So I really am very pleased in a way kind of how all these things work together, and except now for literally being under house arrest, I actually liked the travel, and I liked meeting different people. I definitely am an extrovert, and so what I'm missing is it's one thing to have a lot of Zooms, but you don't get the same buzz off of them if you're an extrovert. But I have had a chance to talk with a lot of different people. The only thing about airports that I don't miss anymore is, I have to tell this story, which is that I was in Heathrow, which is one of the worst airports, and I was picked on in order to show everything. I don't know, just literally picked out of the line, and there I'm on the floor taking everything out of my suitcase. And finally I couldn't stand it, and I never did this, but I said, "Excuse me," to the guy, "do you know who I am?" And he said, "No, but we can find a doctor who can help you figure it out." So it was very hard not to laugh. And so one puts up with some things that are a little weirder than others.
Yeah, indeed. One of the things that is being asked on the chat, and actually I think someone wanted to ask when we had the earlier VIP reception, Madeleine, and we didn't get to it, is what the meaning of the pin is that you're wearing right now. So I feel I need to ask that.
Well, thank you. And I don't know whether people really know the story of why my pins matter, but it all started when I was at the United Nations, and it was right after the Gulf War, and I was an instructed ambassador, and my instructions were to make sure that the sanctions stayed on Iraq, and Saddam Hussein deserved it. He'd invaded Kuwait. So I said terrible things about Iraq every day, and all of a sudden there was a poem in the papers in Baghdad that compared me to many things, but among them an unparalleled serpent. So I had a snake pin, and I started wearing it whenever we talked about Iraq. And so when I was asked about it, and the other ambassadors said, "Well, what are we going to do today?" I said, "Read my pin." So that is how it all started. So this pin bears a real relationship to some of the things that are in the book in terms of talking about, I do in the book talk about what it was like to be a child during World War II in London during the Blitz. And my father was part of the Czechoslovak government in exile. And among the things that he did was he broadcast over BBC into Czechoslovakia. And I was a little girl, and I listened to BBC. I actually thought he was inside the radio. But the thing that I remember was every broadcast for BBC began with the first 5 notes of Beethoven's Fifth on a kettle drum, da-da-da-dum, which in Morse code is V for victory. And so that's why I decided to wear a V pin. And it really reminds me of what my parents used to say is, we couldn't control the bombs, but we can control our mood. And I think that is where we are now in many different ways. Our behavior, being able to control our mood.
Excellent. So that's a great segue from this other destination to, we'll just start talking about hell now.
Yeah.
We have seen over the last 5 to 10 years, and you cover it so beautifully in the book on fascism, the rise of nationalist, authoritarian, powerful, some would say bully leadership in country after country around the world. To what do you attribute that trend, and how do you see that playing out over the near-term horizon?
Well, let me just say, when I wrote the book, I was very concerned about what I was seeing in a variety of countries in terms of the rise of authoritarianism. I had, for instance, in my time with the National Democratic Institute, spent time in Hungary, and Viktor Orban in the 80s was everybody's favorite dissident. And all of a sudden, he's running a completely authoritarian government. I was concerned about some of the things that were happening in Poland and Turkey. And so I wanted to know more about what the basis of all of it was, and what fascism really meant. By the way, it's a term that people throw around without thinking about what it means. You know, anybody you disagree with is a fascist. Or I sometimes talk about the teenage boy who is not allowed to drive and calls his father a fascist. And so I think that the issue is basically, what is it? And fascism is not an ideology. It's a process for getting and keeping power. And so I went back to look at the birth of it, and obviously Mussolini was the first fascist. And what happened was that Italy had fought on the side of the Allies during World War I and had not really been recognized as having done something vital. And there also were divisions in the Italian society. And Mussolini was an outsider who spoke well and really took advantage in terms of making the divisions even greater, and pushing and pushing. And the best quote in the book comes from Mussolini, who says, if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices. And I think it's a lot of small steps, frankly. And so I was concerned about all the feather plucking that I was seeing. By the way, you can't say those two words together too quickly. And so the bottom line is that I looked a little bit at what, and by the way, both Mussolini and Hitler came to power constitutionally. In Italy, King Emmanuel asked Mussolini to take over, and in Germany, von Hindenburg asked Hitler. And there had been elections in the various countries that I have studied, in Hungary, Turkey, Poland, the Philippines, and in Venezuela, for instance. And so I was trying to figure out the basis, and the basis really of it is that a leader identifies himself, and by their way, they're all himselves, with one group at the expense of another, whose fault it is, the scapegoats. And so dividing society is the major aspect of the basis of authoritarianism and fascism. And I think then you have leaders that think they're above the law, who think that the press is the enemy of the people, and then also who don't try to find out what the group that they disagree with, what they're about. Why is there disagreement? So those authoritarian trends is what I was warning against. And it deliberately was. It's called a warning, deliberately.
And is there a global set of trends that you see that we're seeing this in multiple countries, as you point out? And is it, a moment in time? I mean, we don't live through multiple, centuries. We only live in a moment in time. But will historians sometime in the future say, it was one of those dark moments in time. It came and it went. It lasted a decade or two, and then democracy rose again? Or do you see things to be more concerned about?
Well, both, frankly, but I think the following thing. I've sometimes talked about two mega trends and their downside. So one mega trend is globalization, from which I think most people have benefited, actually. But it does have a downside because it's faceless. And so people want to know what their identity is. I think everybody wants to know their background, what is their identity, and that's fine. But unless my identity hates your identity, and then it becomes nationalism, and hyper-nationalism is very dangerous and does lead to a way of making things worse, of hating your neighbor and of concern. The other mega trend is technology, which also has had great advantages. I love to talk about the woman farmer who walks zillions of miles in Kenya to pay her bills and doesn't have to do that anymore because she can do it over her iPhone. And it allows her then to either get an education or start a business and really have a life that allows her some freedom. The downside of it is that it has divided voices, and we don't know where we get our information. And it has made it harder to get groupings together in order to get change. And democracy is not a spectator sport. You need to have people that build coalitions and work in elections. And so that has undermined some of the democratic aspects and led to nationalism. And by the way, this is a completely plagiarized line from Silicon Valley, but it describes very well what has happened. Is people are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments listen to them on 20th century technology and provide 19th century responses. And so there's no faith in institutions. And those are the kinds of things that we're seeing now. And I do believe that democracies are fragile, but also resilient. And so, and I am an optimist who worries a lot, but I do really think that it's a bad period in time, but, and if we recognize what has caused all this, then I think we have it within our power to get into a different era. And I think it's going to be a lot of work.
Do you think there's a glimmer of optimism in the just announced agreement between the UAE and Bahrain and Israel? Is there something positive in the short or long term to be taken from that? How do you view that?
Well, I have actually, I've tried to be optimistic, and I just, today in Politico, there is an op-ed that I did with Steve Hadley, because I also try very hard to do bipartisan things. And I do think that there is some glimmer there in terms of understanding that there are ways for countries that disagree to find ways of working together. But it certainly, by the way, Steve and I did a project together going to the Middle East before all this, and kind of seeing some green shoots in terms of young people that were more interested in being a part of their societies, getting an education, trying to figure out how to bury old enmity. There continue to be problems in the Middle East. And one of the tragedies, I do keep going over everything in my head, which is it was the summer of 2000 that we were at Camp David with the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I think that we came pretty close to getting something, but we need to somehow still be able to be in a position where the United States can act as an honest broker between the Israelis and Palestinians. We can't make the leaders make decisions, but we can at least try to make something happen on that front also. But yes, I'm willing to say that there is some glimmer of hope on what just happened.
And are there some leaders in the world today that, and I know you don't always like to name names, but I'll ask you anyway, some leaders that you think are doing as good a job as can be done with all of these circumstances in trying to promote, whether they disagree or agree with the person on the other side of the table, on the other side of the trade talk, are showing the kind of leadership traits that you would like to see more of?
Well, Angela Merkel is a perfect example of somebody that really is a problem solver and is working on things. I do think that there are potential leaders in the United States. One of them is running for president. And I do think that there are those in the United States that want to run for office in a way to be able to make a difference. And there are various people around the world that do. And I do think that one of the things that I like thinking about is that there is a whole cohort of young and slightly older people that have had experiences of being exchange students or spent time out of their country, that have ways of, and are problem solvers that want to make a difference. So yes, I do believe that there are those that want to make a difference. And I think the important part, what I find very hard to deal with at the moment is trying to figure out what people's sources of information are. And the hard part, because it makes me seem like such a relativist, is it's really hard to tell what the truth is, frankly, unless you read or watch a lot of different things in order to be able to make up your mind about what's happening. You would think that we would be able to really ground ourselves in facts but they are viewed differently. And by the way, I make it a point of listening to things with which I disagree. So when I did drive, I used to listen to right-wing radio as I drove, making me a dangerous driver. Now I can sit on my sofa and listen to Fox, but I do think that it's important to listen to different news. And I do think that it makes you wonder what those that disagree with some of the stuff that's on CNN and MSNBC feel about what they hear. And so I think it is hard, you know, where is our information coming from? And that I think is a hard part at the moment.
I agree. There was a question in the chat from the audience about the role of social media and the disinformation. There's so much of it. You know, both of us are of an age when there were fewer sources of information and there were trusted sources of the news. That they didn't take one particular side or another, they just reported the news. And it seems that everything today is couched in a very partisan way. And that's true of both sides of the aisle, but both sides of the discussion. So it takes more work, not less, for folks to discern what the truth is. It feels like a really heavy burden.
Yeah, I think
right
it
now.
is. I think it's hard. I think we have to admit that.
And what advice would you give to people? There's a comment made also about all the things that you've been through personally, professionally, and yet you describe these tumultuous situations in your book, and anyone who's listened to interviews with you, with such grace and such calmness. What advice, if any, would you have for people in this audience about how to, you know, you talk about yourself as an optimist who worries a lot. The word that I coined a number of years ago is optorealist, you know, grounded in reality, but optimistic about the future. But how is it you get there? And how do you, in this time when you seem bombarded with the disinformation, the death of democracy, and all of the issues that we are faced with every day, how do you develop that for yourself?
Well, I kind of, first of all, I do think about all the things that my parents went through and how they made a new life for themselves in the United States, and grounded in the sense that they could make a difference in the way that they lived their lives. I also do think that one can get mired in a bad mood, and then it kind of builds on itself. I have to say I am encouraged by my grandchildren, one of whom turned 18 a couple of weeks ago, and one of whom is turning 21 this week. And they're talking about voting and all the things that they want to do. And then the other 4 also are activists. And I am very encouraged by their behavior and encouraged by my students, frankly. And so I've decided that I deliberately do not want to be in a bad mood. I mean, it takes work, and there are moments when I think, all right, I'm just going to sit here and not do anything. And at that point, I think that's ridiculous. No matter how you slice it, you're not going to be around forever. Do something. So
I love the fact there's a moment in the book where you say sometimes you just have to vent, and that sometimes you just found yourself venting. One of the things that you do refer to, and clearly your life has provided tremendous perspective. One of the questions from the audience has to do with the study of history and how you feel the study of history could be important and helpful to provide us a way to set that context and to understand what's going on not only now, but you know, what has gone on in the world, and maybe the roots of what's happening now may go back decades, it might go back centuries. What do you think about history as a subject for school?
I think it's very important. I think that, you know, there's always, if you don't know history, you're bound to repeat it. But I really do think that it's interesting to know, and some form really of making yourself feel better if you think we've been through something like this before, or whatever it is, that people are problem solvers. It's just interesting to read about various parts of history. And also, I do think, especially for somebody that's involved in international relations, I think it's very important to understand why countries behave or people behave the way they do, because it is their history. So for instance, you were asking about the Middle East. So I worked for a president who read a lot and assigned us books. So one of the books that President Clinton assigned to me was a book called The Peace to End All Peace, which was about the history of the creation of the modern Middle East after World War I. The short version of the book is that the modern Middle East was created by the British and French bureaucracies lying to each other and creating some artificial countries. And what is interesting, frankly, is how you can link different things together. So for instance, President Macron just went to Lebanon, and some people were writing about the fact, so, you know, what are they trying to do? The French take over the Middle East again or whatever, or knowing, for instance, that the Russians have tried for a long time to exert their influence over the Middle East, or that there have been issues between, most Americans know nothing about Islam, much less the difference between the Shia and Sunni, and then the age-old struggle between the Persians, i.e. the Iranians and the Arabs. And so I think it's useful to have some context for what you're seeing and understanding the behavior, or the Chinese at this point, who keep talking about 100 years of humiliation, which is the way that they felt about the way the West had treated them. So I think it's important to understand the historical context of what one is seeing.
You know, it's interesting. You were just talking about spending time listening to positions and people that you know you're going to disagree with. And there's a great line in one of my favorite movies, The American President, where President Shepard says, democracy isn't for the faint of heart, that you have to believe that while you're standing on one side of the road, shouting at the top of your voice for something that someone on the other side of the road can be shouting at the top of their voice for something that's just the opposite, something that you would find reprehensible. What advice would you give to all of us and to young people for how to seek out to understand the other side, how to be able to hear it without, I guess it's hard to do it without judgment, but you know what I mean, without name calling and being divisive and shutting down? What are the attributes that you think you've learned that you could pass on that help us get better at that?
Well, I do think that it would be important to figure out what those with whom we disagree really think. And it's not easy, frankly. I have tried it, and I was somewhere where this seems like the dark ages now. I'd gone to the movies, and there were two women that came up to me that had Trump buttons on. And I said, why do you want to have your picture taken with me? And why are you for Trump? And they didn't want to have a discussion about it. But anyway, I at least tried. I do think it's important to figure out why people believe what they do. I also think, this may sound crazy, but I don't like the word tolerance, because that's tolerate, put up with. I think we need to respect people for what they believe in if they can explain why they actually do believe in it, and then have conversations about it. But it is the hardest thing to do, frankly, and yet it is the way that ultimately you can solve problems. I have always, one of the lessons of a diplomat is that it's absolutely essential to put yourself into the other person's shoes. What is it that not everything has to be zero sum. There can be ways that there can be win-wins where where in fact there is a way to come up with some answers that are suitable for everybody.
There's one of the instructors in a Strategies for Success program TCI runs always says, try to be curious, not furious.
Yeah, well,
and
that's a very good line.
It sounds like something that you do. And one of the things that is striking in all of your books, when you talk about various critical issues and places and times that you've been involved where there's been wild and vicious disagreement, is your uncanny ability to reach across and at least hear. And even the op-ed you mentioned a minute ago, I mean, you're co-writing with someone that you probably don't agree with on a lot of things. So I think that's really important and a great lesson for all of us. So now I'm going to get even deeper into hell with you, Madeleine.
Yeah.
Here we are in 2020. And who could have written this script? You're in the middle of a pandemic and it's not over. I don't care what people say. We're still in pandemic season. The economy has been bandied about because of that. People are out of work. Unemployment benefits are running out for people this week. We've had a rise again in the recognition of centuries-old issues with regard to race. We have more polarization than certainly I've ever seen in my lifetime in this country. Bigger divides, harder to communicate. And oh yeah, we have an election that we're trying to execute in a constitutional way. How do you see all of these dynamics playing out as we move into November 3rd? Kind of how do you see it? What do you worry about? And what gives you confidence about this election season?
Well, I have to say, not just the way you describe it, but also the way I see it, there's a lot to worry about. It's kind of a confluence of horrible events that are growing as a result of bumping up against each other in terms of the various issues and how they interconnect. And I think that it is going to take a lot of problem solving that is not going to be resolved immediately, and patience that is not my long suit. But I think basically we need to understand that there is resilience in democracy, that there are ways, and I've been obviously listening to a lot of things where certain governors and local officials are trying to sort out how, it's hard to believe that we all of a sudden don't have faith in the mail system or something. It isn't as if we haven't done that for a while. And that there needs to be some way to calm down rather than getting more and more hysterical. And since there is one person that's running that likes to have the hysteria, in fact lives off of it, I think that we need to figure out how to really exhibit a sense of faith and patience and calmness. The other part that I find interesting is that there are those that are working on some very specific remedies already in terms of how to make sure that people understand how the voting system works and the various aspects. But one of them that I thought was very useful is that some of the TV people have said that they have made a mistake in the past by declaring a winner in a race, even though the race isn't even over then, and kind of jumping the gun on it, and that they need to be careful to begin to explain that we're not just going to have election day, we may have election week or even longer than that, and that the responsible members of the press, and I think that there are a lot of them, need to help in terms of kind of calming things down rather than being worried about ratings or various things, or understanding that some of the polling is showing what, it takes a huge effort, but I think that we're all going to have to be part of it, because it is what there are going to be a lot of peculiar things that happen. And I think that we need to remember that we are the world's oldest democracy, and that we have been through bad things, and that there are ways to solve it. But it's going to take an effort, not just by one or two people, but kind of a way of developing a calmness. And in terms of what I said earlier, what our mood is. We can all sit alone and become hysterical, or try to figure out, we're problem solvers. And I think that we need to figure out how to support those that are trying to sort out how actually to have the secure boxes, or how to count, or think about what the problems will be and try to solve them ahead of time.
Do you have any real worries about, because there's a lot of talk right now, but do you have any real worries about the integrity and the validity of the election?
From no, I don't actually. I mean, I think that we do know how to vote, and we do know how to seal envelopes and sign our name. I think that there will be some problems along the way. And I think the question is whether we view the problems as terminal, or whether they can be explained as something that happened that can be overcome. But I can make myself get all stirred up about, that everything will go wrong, or he won't leave office, or whatever. But that doesn't get you anywhere. And I think that when I was talking earlier about, I was asked to describe myself in 6 words not long ago, which was, I said, worried optimist, problem solver, grateful American. And they do all go together. And so I do think that we are capable of solving problems if we don't panic.
There's been, of course, rightfully so much attention on the national election, on the federal election, maybe not as much on what's going on in the states. And that's in an environment where, as there's been so much, whatever side you sit on, disruption or freezing or whatever at the national level, states have stepped up more and more. I mean, the states have really had to step up during COVID and so on and so forth. Do you think that there are important issues that will get handled and resolved at the state level? And does the fact that we have a state system also give you some reason for optimism or a good feeling about the strength of our democracy?
Yes, it does. And I think it was this morning, actually, I was listening to somebody that was a Secretary of State of one of the states, that there is a group of those secretaries of state that have handled this before, and that they are working together to try to figure it out. By the way, I have to tell you a story during the 2000 election when everything was going wrong. I was Secretary of State as they were going through it. And so there were the former Secretaries of State Baker and Secretary of State Christopher. And then there was the person that was the Secretary of State of Florida. And I was asked to go somewhere, and I said, my name is Madeleine Albright. I am the Secretary of State of the United States of America currently, because there were so many, how many Secretaries of States there are. But I do think that there are states that have handled this. The place I grew up in, Colorado, has one. And there are a number, and I do think the state system is something, and then some of the local people that are more visible to their neighbors that can do something. Yes.
Are you concerned about, or do you think we have mechanisms in place to protect us from any undue meddling, philandering from Russia and China in the election?
I'm worried about that because there's been a denial of the facts that this has really happened. But I think that the more people know that some of the news that is being reported or whatever is in fact something that is coming from outside, I think we need to be, the question here really, Pam, is how we can be conscious of the problems and not panic by the problems. I think it's important to know that there are attempts to hack. And I think as I've been reading and listening recently, there are those who wish that more had been done by the Obama administration to warn about it. I think we've now been warned, and I can understand why they behaved the way they did, because it looked as though they were politicizing everything. But I think we have enough testimony and validity. By the way, I do think that what the House committees have been doing in terms of getting at the truth is really remarkable. Adam Schiff and the kind of things that they are doing. And I think we are now more aware of this kind of hacking going on and the various ways to interfere in our election.
Do you think it's time to call a day with the Electoral College? Has it had its moment in the sun and now
Well,
we're done
it
with
certainly seems to have, because it's also based on a different political problem and distribution of population from an earlier time. The only problem is that it's not a simple activity in terms of, as I understand it, it would take a constitutional amendment and a number of different ways, and there has been an effect of some of the things that the Trump people have tried to do to our judicial system. So, but it doesn't seem to reflect the will of the people. And I can understand, by the way, I think part of it, the institutions of democracy are created in one era, but in the end, there's a certain flexibility in them, but you have to, otherwise we all wouldn't be able to talk to each other or vote at the moment, you know, so.
Right. Well, I mean, isn't that the genius?
No.
Isn't that the genius of our founding documents? The genius of our Constitution is that it can be modified.
Absolutely.
And it can
Yep.
be evolved with our country.
Yep.
So regardless of who wins the election, and maybe it's a non sequitur kind of question, but regardless of who wins the election, how do we bring the United States together? How do we stand as a nation in the world? How do we become more of what we all, I think people on the left and on the right certainly have aspirations for the country to be successful economically and to be well respected and well regarded. Is it the case that it will be virtually impossible with one election outcome and maybe possible with the other, or is there a way for us to move forward regardless of who's elected?
Well, we do have to move ahead in some way because things are not waiting for us. The economy does become very important. Climate change, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what is going on. And I do think that there are a variety of ways through other levels of the government to raise issues, as you pointed out, not just the elections, but generally in terms of making the elements of democracy work. I think that the part that is hard at the moment is that no matter who wins, it's not going to be easy to get out of the whole set of issues to do with the virus that could have been dealt with, wasn't dealt with. And so there are going to be issues about testing and all the various instructions that we have. And it's just better to have somebody who doesn't deny the truth elected and who doesn't deny the truth about what's happened to the economy and our jobs and how we fit into the world. The problem, and it will be a very serious problem if Trump is reelected, because I think I happen to believe that our domestic situation has a lot to do in, or the other way around, the international situation affects our domestic situation and vice versa. And so I am worried that because we have created a situation where we have lost the respect of other countries, where we are seen as AWOL, absent, or bullying or blaming others for the fact that we are seen as victims, I think it will be very hard. And the question is, how does one operate if that happens? Because another 4 years of this will make things very, very much harder. And it may be that there will continue to be a small group of people that are very rich. But what has happened, and I find stunning, and something that goes against everything. When we came to the United States, I grew up in Denver in the 50s, and it was a middle-class country. And my father used to say, oh, this is so different from Europe, where there's the intelligentsia that doesn't do anything. And he was so surprised that his students actually went out and pumped gas when people used to do that, or wait on tables, that would never happen in Europe. And so all of a sudden, seeing this real difference between the small group of very, very rich people and a diminishing middle class and a whole group of very, very poor people. And the race issue is just stunningly, there are no words for it. I mean, it really is systemic racism. And I think that we have to deal with that, and the issue of how we need laws, but not at the expense of a whole group of people. There are many issues that need to be resolved and worked on by people who want to solve problems, not create more of them. And that's the issue. How would we behave? It'll be hard under any circumstances, but really debilitating if we don't have a leader that understands things. And I hope very much that as we go forward, that we, and especially if the Democrats win, that we don't become a firing line in a circle. We need to work together. Unity is one of the important parts that will have to happen, and a way of listening to those with whom we disagree.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think if the Democrats were to win and then go about doing what the Democrats say the other side did last time and just stonewalling everything, we really haven't made any forward progress. So do you think that certainly the current administration, I think both sides have to agree, has really pushed the boundaries in terms of what we have come to expect out of the White House and what we've come to expect out of a president? Some people like it, some people don't like it, but I think we can agree that those boundaries have been pushed. Do you think that the last 4 years have shown the weaknesses and frailties of our democracy, or shown the resiliency and strength of our democracy?
Well, I hope the latter, because I really do believe in resiliency of democracy. But I now have quoted my parents or father all the time. I mean, he used to say that he was afraid that Americans took democracy for granted. And I think we have had that kind of sense. It's up to somebody else to do things. And that's why I keep saying democracy is not a spectator sport. And it's going to take work, either in terms of talking to people with whom you disagree, or really trying to sort out what are the community problems, because every community does have some that have clearly been latent. And I think that there'll be a hard time of kind of trying to say, tell me what you really think about this. What are the things that, I mean, some of the things I've seen are horrendous in terms of how people have treated each other. And I do think that while I hail the Constitution, and it is basic, there are those that are interpreting certain amendments, especially the right to guns, in a way that is counterintuitive to what needs to be done in this society. It isn't as if, we need militias at the moment. And so I do think it's going to take, and citizenship, by the way, I think basically one of the things that's happened, just you were asking about history, what happened back in the Middle Ages was that people gave up some of their individual rights in order to have governments that provided certain services and took care of them. And in exchange for that, they, in fact, had some responsibilities and privileges as citizens. I think what has happened is the social contract is broken. Neither side is fulfilling what it is supposed to do. And I think there need to be more kind of an assessment of what should the role of the government be and what is the privilege and responsibility of citizenship. And it's going to take having discussions and the importance of our education and our health system. So I think that we took certain things for granted. That's part of the problem, that they didn't need TLC, and so I think we all will have to pitch in and do some work.
Yeah, I think that out of this, for me, it's been a dark period the last several years. The thing that I do take as light is that so many of these topics are being discussed now and are being looked at, whether it's been ignorance, willful blindness, comfort, whatever, have not been dealt with seriously and seem to be certainly in every corporate boardroom I'm in. I know the ones you're in, and with your clients, they're very much being taken seriously. The younger generation, and really not just the younger generation, are pushing companies not just to put fancy words on the wall, but to actually take action and to take a stand on some of these issues. So it may be that the threat is starting to stimulate or kick some people out of the apathy that you were talking about. I'm going to switch gears now because I promised bookends and we wouldn't spend all of our time in hell. So we're going to go back to another destination. And this segment I call Madeleine Unplugged, because in the midst of all of the serious issues that are sprinkled throughout this book and the behind the scenes look at various issues that Secretary Albright has dealt with in her life, there is Madeleine, the feisty, charming woman. And there's so many interesting stories. I mean, this segment, I'm only going to have time to raise a couple of questions here, but so interesting. So one thing I found really interesting, Madeleine, is even as a child, you were a creator of clubs. That for folks who haven't read the book yet, Madeleine moved around a bit as a youngster, and wherever she went, she created an international club and conveniently elected herself president. And then if you fast forward to many years later, out of government as an adult, you created the G7. Well, actually, I think you were still in government, the G7, then the group of 34, and various clubs that you've had gathered, salons that you've hosted at your house. What's this club business that has been such a big part of your life?
Well, I definitely am an extrovert, and I love to have people around me to laugh and have fun and do some work. And so one of the things, and some of it has to do very specifically with the importance of supporting women. By the way, the way that this title came about was the most famous thing I ever said was there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other. And it was so famous it ended up on a Starbucks cup. So I have tried very hard to live up to what I believe needs to happen is women supporting each other. So I get to the United Nations in 1993. And at that stage, there were 183 countries there. And it was one of the first times I didn't have to cook lunch myself. So I asked my assistant to invite the other women permanent representatives to lunch. So I go to my apartment and there's 6 other women there out of all of those from Canada, Kazakhstan, Philippines, Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, and Liechtenstein, and me. And because I was the American, I created a caucus. And we called ourselves the G7. And we decided as the G7 to lobby. There was a new war crimes tribunal created to deal with the problems in Bosnia. And because most of the crimes were against women, and we lobbied this war crimes tribunal to have women judges. And we managed to get 2 women judges on it. And then when we had, when I became secretary, I did a group of women foreign ministers. There were only 14 at that time. But I do love to do that kind of thing. And I think that there's strength in numbers and certainly friendships. And so I definitely am a groupie. Sometimes they're co-ed. I mean, one of the things that I did was I invented something really new as Secretary of State, which was the International Telephone Conference Call back in the dark ages. And so we all talked to each other during the war in Kosovo, and we all missed each other afterwards. So I created a group of former foreign ministers, and it's officially under the Aspen Institute, but it's and it's called Aspen Ministers Forum, but unofficially it's known as Madeleine and her exes. And because I didn't have enough exes, I added some people, and a lot of them have been the women that became foreign ministers after I left office. So, and we meet all the time. So I do the best I can to replicate groups, even if I can't be with them literally.
Well, I think it's part of that connection thing that you said, 45 minutes ago, that you really enjoy connecting people, particularly if they have different perspectives. So we're getting toward the end of our hour, but I have to ask you to just spend just a minute on Madeleine, the TV star. So, Madam Secretary, Parks and Rec, which I know I have my millennial kids are, I think, on this call and probably very happy to hear that. Gilmore Girls, how was that?
Well, it's a lot. Let me tell you how it started. I was out of office and I get a call from the producers of Gilmore Girls saying, would I mind if somebody played me? And I said, yes, I mind. I want to play myself. So that's how it started. It was much harder than it looked because it was repeating a conversation that happened on Rory's birthday every year. So you had to have exactly the right words. So I had to memorize things. And my daughters, because Rory looks like my youngest daughter, said, Mom, you weren't acting, you were playing yourself. So then Parks and Rec was fun. And the reason for that was that Amy Poehler, I knew, had a picture of me in her office, and there had been one of the episodes was some guy comes in and wants to date her and says, is that your grandmother? And she said, anyone who doesn't know who Madeleine Albright is, I'm not going out with. But Madam Secretary has been fun. And I've now done several segments of that. But the last one was to open this particular season. And they had invited General Powell and Secretary Clinton and me to come. And the whole thing was totally scripted. And so something horrible had happened at the White House, and she called us in to have to get some advice. And so I got an unscripted line in. As we were about to sit down, I said, isn't it nice when the current Secretary of State calls her predecessors in to ask their advice? We used to do that all the time, and they left that in. So I get my lines in occasionally, but I have had a lot of fun. And one of the things that happened when I was Secretary of State was, and you're asked to do things you would never occur to you. I was told that there's this ASEAN regional forum where the US, every country performs a skit the last night, and the United States always does badly. And I said, well, I'm not going. And they said, you have to go. So the State Department gave me lyrics to Mary Had a Little Lamb or something. And as we're flying over, I said, I am not doing this. And so on the plane, we created that I was going to sing Don't Cry for Me, ASEANis. I got dressed up as Madonna. The rest of the delegation was the background. And so I love to have fun. I really do. People are surprised. And even to this day, when I'm saying or doing something, I had my grandchildren at something and they said, we didn't realize that Grandma Maddie was so funny. So I do the best I can.
So I want to thank you so much, Madeleine. You guys need to get this book. It is full of history. It is full of great stories. It is interwoven with the woman you've seen tonight. Smart, funny, self-effacing. It's the only historical novel by the living person who went through the history, where you'll also read about orgasms and serious pigeons and drum beats and everything else. I mean, it's just a wackadoodle. It's wonderful. It has great pictures in it, and you'll see some of the things Madeleine was just talking about, singing, dancing, playing the drums, for goodness sake. Pictures of her with people like Robert Redford, who to women of a certain age is still a heartthrob. But my favorite one, Madeleine, was, and this is the one I just was so envious, your picture with the Queen, Aretha Franklin, was just amazing in here. Thank you so much for the time with us. And let me turn it back over for a quick minute to Elizabeth.
Pam, thank you for all your great questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Secretary and Pam, for a terrific conversation. Could not be more thrilled to be part of this. And a super big thank you to you, Secretary Albright, for coming back to the Institute 7 times. I wanted to quickly say, every time that I hear you speak, I think, along with many others, feel like I just took a graduate course. I'm taking copious notes and trying to listen and watch your face at the same time. It's just, I wish we could do this for 2 more hours, but I know we can't. The TCI community is very grateful for your continued engagement with the TCI community and for your support for all the important work that we're doing to develop and advance all women. It has truly been a pleasure and a privilege to welcome you back to the Institute. Lizzie Dunkley will add a link on the chat about the book discount that Pam just mentioned, the book. If you click on that link, it entitles you to a discount for the book and also a signed bookplate from Madam Secretary. In closing, those of you who know me, I always take an opportunity to not only thank our sponsors again, American Tower, Lock Lord, the Center for Women and Wealth at Brown Brothers, Harriman, Houseworks, Hub International, and RSM. I also want to make sure that I get in a quick TCI infomercial, and it's quick. Lizzie, I think we'll put up the slide. We have we have many major things, but I just want to draw your attention to three things. The third annual TCI Massachusetts Women's Leadership Study is open for submission until the end of this month. Make sure you participate. It's just a terrific way to shine a light on what companies across the Commonwealth are doing to develop, retain, and advance women. Our next Strategies for Success Leadership Development Program is almost sold out. Starts October 7th. So if you're interested, please register. We've moved to a virtual format in the middle of the cohort this spring, and who would have thought it's much more powerful. The 20th annual Top 100 Women-Led Business Awards will be held November 6th. It will be a virtual event, but I want to make sure you have the date, and more information will be coming on that. So in closing, again, Secretary Albright, cannot thank you enough. You are just a rock star. I love the personal stories. I think we all do. And you've given us so much to think about. So again, thank you so much. And I wish you a great rest of your evening. And thank you to all of you who were part of this tonight. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good night, Madeleine.
Good night. See ya. Thanks.
Love
Bye-bye.
you. See you soon. Bye-bye.